Hello everyone and welcome to this webinar. I'm Francis Seeley from M4 Voices and GlobalNet 21, and this is one of the regular webinars we do. And today we're going to talk about a subject called ecocide, and that's damage, irreparable damage to the planet, caused by a number of factors and particularly climate change. Now, some time ago, I met a remarkable lady called Polly Higgins, and she sort of dedicated her life to making damage to the planet become an international crime, just like war crimes are, or crimes against human rights. And she started with a group of equally remarkable people to foster this campaign and to make it become in the public domain. But in order to find out a bit more about what ecocide is, let's listen to what Polly has to say.
You could say I'm a lawyer for the earth. What I'm seeking for is to have ecocide recognised as an international law, and that's to criminalise mass damage and destruction. But it's also to create a legal duty of care to give assistance for not just the human-caused, human-made ecocides, but also the naturally occurring ecocides. Because after all, at the moment we're looking at something like 650 environmental refugees, 650 million environmental refugees by 2050, and that's an outrageous number of people that we're not even beginning to think about or look at. You know, these are the ticking time bombs for the future.
That's what Polly had to say. Now, sadly, Polly died about a few months ago, and she was only 50. So in a way, this webinar is partly a tribute to her and the work she's done with the group of people she works with. And we do have one of those people with us today. We're very fortunate to have Anita van Rossam with us, who's going to talk to us about the work that they do. So welcome to the webinar, Anita, and it's great to have you here. So can we start by could you tell us something about yourself, the work you do with your organization and the work that the organization does itself?
So my place in the ecocide team, well, I'll explain to you just briefly how it happened, that it is even a part of my life. It has actually become my life. It was 2014 that I first heard of Polly, and I attended a conference in London University, and I expected her to be there for an hour, but very generously, as was her nature, she was there for the whole day, and I was able to get to know her, and I was able to understand the incredible importance, urgency of her work. So it really inspired me. She also personally inspired me, because she was a remarkable human being, apart from her rigorous professional engagement with her work, which became her life's work, actually. And so I decided to up sticks and leave where I'd been living for 20 years in West Sussex. And I wrote to Polly and said, I want to come and help. I'm not a lawyer, but I want to help. And I didn't really think she'd write back, but she did. She wrote back immediately. And so this is now history. I went up to live there, and from 2015 I was a part of her team. Sadly now, as Francis explained, and very shockingly and unexpectedly, we lost Polly to a very rapid form of cancer. She actually passed on April the 21st, Easter Sunday. So if you have to go, I guess it was a very good day to choose. However, you know, her influence to the many people she connected with from all walks of life during her very vivid and vigorous life, because she was a person who was so full of energy and a very charismatic person who drew people to her wherever she went. And so from that legacy, we are now fortunate enough to have so many people coming in to volunteer, to offer skills, to widen out the vital importance of this work of hers. And that is where we're at now. So I am a part of that, and I consider it a huge privilege. My actual role is what it says on the card, Head of Outreach and Campaigning. So when I refer to the campaign, I'm talking about the Earth Protector movement, with the aim.
Well, let's talk about that in a minute, because we'll go through those point by point. What I think it would be good to do at the beginning is, I mean, a lot of people know what ecocide is, and I explained it briefly, but maybe not enough. Could you let people who don't know what ecocide means, can you let them know what exactly it is?
Yes, of course. Well, there is a legal definition, which I can simply read. So ecocide is the extensive loss or damage or destruction of ecosystems of a given territory to such an extent that peaceful enjoyment by the inhabitants of that territory has been or will be severely diminished. So shall I explain that a little bit more in layman's language?
Okay.
Right. So extensive loss, damage, or destruction. There, of course, we're very familiar with ecocides such as the clearing of rainforest, the history of the palm oil exercise in Indonesia, pollution, pesticides, ocean plastics. So what you're talking about there is mass devastation to such an extent. And when Polly wrote peaceful enjoyment, that means the right to life, the right to a life which is peaceful, and the right to a life which is healthy and safe. And another very important point, so obviously all those examples I mentioned before completely put that at risk and make that enjoyment no longer possible.
Okay, so you know, you're not just saying that the destruction of the planet and how it affects particular communities is something we should address by persuading those companies to reduce their carbon footprint. You're saying it's a lot more than that. They should be held legally responsible for what they do.
Yes, absolutely. There is just one word in that definition, which I'd just like to refer back to, which is inhabitants. And that as well is very important, because this is not just about human beings. It is about every aspect of an ecosystem, down to the microscopic, the air, the soil, the waters. So it's everything. And as we are all connected, it's really important, because without the ecosystem, we can't survive either.
There is, isn't there, a Rome Statute of the International Court. Is that not sufficient, or do we need more than that?
Well, the Rome Statute is the codifying document of the International Criminal Court. And when it was set up, there were 4 crimes originally included. Genocide is the one which is most largely known. Now, at the time in the 1990s, when it was being negotiated, ecocide actually was on the table as a crime, but strangely, it was actually hidden under the table behind closed doors at that point by 4 nations, regrettably UK, France, the Netherlands, and the US, all oil states. And it never saw the light of day, and it was only until Polly started work on this concept of ecocide, which she believed was her word to describe the new narrative needed for mass destruction of the earth. But then she discovered that actually it had been on the table in the 1990s. So now we're talking actually about reinstating missing crime, because originally it was there.
And I gather that there is something like 100 companies in the world that are responsible for 70% of emissions. And are these the ones that you believe are largely criminally culpable for the crimes that they create if you got ecocide accepted as an international crime?
Yeah, well, if you're looking at climate ecocide, which of course is the one that is most currently in our vision at the moment, with the threat to, you know, the breakdown of our climate and all that that implies, then climate ecocide can be laid at the door, it would seem, of the 100 major carbon majors, who are, of course, the fossil fuel companies, who produce 78% of our emissions. So one can't really call them guilty until they would be proven such. However, that seems to be a scientific fact. So maybe we can assume that there is certainly a guilty element. But yeah, fossil fuels and the production thereof, and the reckless persisting in producing knowing what it is doing to our climate, that is where you're looking at an atrocity crime, which would be climate ecocide.
Okay, so you want to make those who are responsible culpable. How do you plan to go about doing that? What sort of international framework do you need?
Well, Polly discovered what she called the legal fast track. And it's not even actually complicated, because passing a new law normally would be a very time-consuming, laborious affair. So now the Rome Statute, the possibility there is to table an amendment, and there has already been an amendment regarding crimes of aggression. So there is a precedent for that. So it's built in, and it can be done, and it has been done. And so what we're looking for, and this really is the major body of Polly's work, because her principal aim and her really sole aim was to table the law of ecocide as an amendment to the Rome Statute. And that is absolutely what is in our focus and our priority now, to carry on her work. And so how does that happen? There are 122 signatories to the Rome Statute. They are heads of state. Each one of those heads of state, no matter how small, can have a vote and a voice. Now, there are several of those signatories that are very, very small. For example, the small island Pacific states. They are in the front line of climate ecocide, and they are the ones who are most in need of this law, because they have waited for 24 years with different climate talks, as we all know, and actually nothing happens. And so now it is getting to an absolutely critical, desperate point. And so what Polly has proposed is the way to actually resolve this apparently terrible situation. It is the solution. Get that amendment tabled, and then things start to roll out.
So, I mean, you know, behind this is a belief is that the individual and small communities don't have the power against the big state and the big corporations. And like in human rights legislation, you need something where communities and individuals can seek redress. And that's what you're aiming to do, is that right?
Yes, that's correct. I mean, once that law comes into force, the International Criminal Law of Ecocide, once that is actually on the statute book, what it does, first of all, it will prevent and preempt ecocide, because it holds accountable a corporate director or a government minister who has sanctioned an ecocide. And it gives individual accountability. Now that really, really changes the rules of the game. Okay, it can obviously create a situation where a CEO can think, oh, I could go to jail, better watch my step. And so therefore, how that person or that government minister would roll out that industrial activity would be very, very differently assessed. You know, there would be a far greater risk assessment, really, really, to be very sure that nothing ecocidal could possibly result. But there's another very important side effect, which perhaps is for us in the bigger industrial economic picture, is more important. But, you know, banks are not going to finance an industrial activity which runs the risk of an ecocide, which is a crime, because that's a no-brainer. Why would they? Similarly, investors will not wish to invest in something so risky, and nor will insurers underwrite it. So, you know, what you're actually doing is pulling the rug from under the whole structure of what supports dirty industry at the moment. And this is what Polly always talked about, turning the planetary ship around. Apparently in a great big liner, there is one small lever which, once you push it, turns the whole ship around. So this is the small lever, the law of ecocide.
So you think, do you, that you know, dealing with this through soft laws, trading deals, commercial agreements won't, you know, is not fit for purpose? It won't do it. It won't cut it. You think you need more than that? Relying on those sort of agreements is inadequate?
Well, at the moment, remember, I'm not a lawyer. However, my understanding and what I've learned from Polly over the years, at the moment, there is only civil regulation. So now what we're talking about with ecocide law, it's very important to understand this is not civil law. it is criminal international law. That is the highest law in the land. It is the highest global law. It is the most powerful. Civil law, which at the moment is what we have to regulate dangerous industrial practice, as we all know, what happens is when something like that occurs, which we will qualify an ecocide, as yet it's not recognized as a crime, only in wartime, interestingly, but not in peacetime. In peacetime, you can do whatever you want. You can even ask for a permit to go and destroy the environment, like fracking, for example, or many other things. You can actually get a permit for it. So civil law really does not do the trick, and the regulations, they exert fines. And so most corporate companies will have already calculated into their budget a fine for possible things going wrong. They pay the fine, and then if you remember in the case of the BP Gulf of Mexico, that was clearly an ecocide, but it wasn't a crime because it doesn't exist as a crime yet. And so they paid a huge fine. And 2 months later, they were asking and seeking permission to drill in the Arctic. So this is another thing that's really important about the criminal international law of ecocide. It prohibits the dangerous activity. It stops it at source. So you get preventative, preemptive, prohibitive, which is essentially that protection that Polly was looking for.
I mean, the campaign is really important from your point of view, isn't it? Because some small islands, particularly in the Pacific, are really threatened right now. And those are the sort of small communities that you're initially working with and you're initially hoping to protect.
Well, yes, I mentioned the small island states before. Yes, of course, they're threatened, and there are many, many communities which are already suffering the dire effects of climate ecocide. The point about the small island states is that Polly understood quite clearly that the Western industrial nations are never going to table the law of ecocide because, regrettably, ecocide is very profitable. And so, in our part of the world, we're not going to do that. And so she looked to the parts of the world where they would have the incentive, because ecocide to them means destruction, not profit. And she landed upon the small island states in the Pacific. And effectively, she was working with them for over the last 3 years. And our legal and diplomatic team continue to work with them. And Vanuatu publicly announced at COP24 in Poland last year that they were following the advice of Polly Higgins, and they were seriously considering going down that road to seek redress from the amendment to the Rome Statute.
So is your sort of emphasis on working with the small island states to put pressure on the United Nations to pass such a law? Or do you campaign at all in the United Kingdom and encourage other people to campaign in their nation states to make people aware of the problem and to put pressure on our own governments?
Yeah, well, of course. I mean, the small island states, that's not really a question of a campaign. They would be the ones that Polly was seeking to encourage and advise and advocate to take it forward, because they are signatories to the Rome Statute. And so they have that vote. They have the right to be there. And so now the only problem is that because they are very, very poorly resourced states, they are not industrial nations by practice. And at the moment, their gross national product, such as it is mostly consumed by coping with climate ecocide. So therefore, they actually cannot get to the table in The Hague. In December every year, there is a celebration of the Assembly of State Parties. And that would be where you would table the amendment. And that is where you need to be physically with your legal team to vote and to have your voice heard. And up till now, mostly they can never be there because they simply don't have the resources to get there, nor would they have the legal expertise to be able to know what to do when they do get there. And this is why the campaign comes in. And because Polly wished to protect the earth, not surprisingly, it's called the Earth Protectors. And the aim of the Earth Protectors is to stop ecocide, change the law. So everyone is encouraged to sign up to be an Earth Protector.
Well, tell us a bit more about the Earth Protector, because that's an intriguing, development. And yes, anyone can sign up, but what do they do? What will you expect them to do?
Yeah, well, The Earth Protector Trust Fund is a legal document which Polly very deliberately set up as such, because she realized, for reasons I just explained, that the small nations who have the vote but not the resources, somehow they've got to be financed. So what are we trying to do? We're trying to bring in a law, an amendment, which will create the law of ecocide, making ecocide a crime. So now we need funds because the small states that are not industrialized but have the vote and have the incentive to take it to the table, they cannot do this from their own resources. Usually laws mostly are created by lobbying, by corporations, that you're talking about your civil laws. So they, you know, now it's up to us to bring this law in. So we have the funds. We may not have them individually, but certainly together all over the world, everybody putting into a trust fund, we can create the situation where we can finance this law that we all need for the world we need.
So the Earth Protectors are sort of funders. They're not people who campaign in their own countries around your mission.
Well, yes, as well, Francis. It's and, because obviously this is a big issue. So first of all, when you sign up to become an Earth Protector, you are signing up to be a trustee of the Earth. Now this does, although it's a legal document, ratified in almost every global jurisdiction, because Polly took the trouble to do that. So it means wherever you are, that is a legal document in your global jurisdiction. So now when you do that, you put into a fund which is ring-fenced, and that fund, which is the Earth Protector Trust Fund, that is financing the states who will stand up at the table in The Hague to table the amendment, financing them to get there with the legal team, and also, most importantly, financing the expert legal advice and advocacy to enable them to put the case in a way that is really going to be effective. The other thing about it, it creates visibility. And visibility is very important, because then the corporations, the powers that are continuing with ecocide will hopefully take a step back when there are hundreds of thousands of Earth Protectors all over the world who are saying, ecocide needs to stop, the destruction needs to stop, enough, no more. So it becomes a huge collective voice.
So tell us a bit about your organization then. How is it structured? You've got the Earth Protectors, but how, I mean, you're involved, you're sort of coordinating campaigns. How is your organization structured so that people know what you do?
Right, how is it structured? Well, there are two arms, really. One arm is the legal and diplomatic team that are working directly with the small island states and with the alliances, the states that could possibly table that amendment. So that is one really, really vital, dynamic, very important part. A lot of that has to be confidential because of the nature of the subject. So I can't really go into that anymore. The other arm is what I've been talking about, the campaign. And as I've said before, we have a very vibrant team of over 30 people working with different levels of expertise, from social media to publicity to global strategy, etc., etc. Another very important part of the kind of structure is also something you mentioned before, Francis. As being an Earth Protector, you also have well, in fact, anybody can do this. You don't have to be a signed up Earth Protector. You go onto the website and there is a national petition to petition the government in our country to please demand the law of ecocide. And that petition has a template that people in every country can translate into their own languages. So then gradually you get the build-up of global demand for a law of ecocide to stop the destruction.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about the petition, but you've actually mentioned it now,
sorry.
and people can find that clearly on the website. Yeah. Okay, so, I mean, Polly's done this remarkable thing, and, you know, she's been absolutely dedicated and an amazing lady doing it. Now you've got to the state where you are some years on. Where are you now on this? Where do you think you've, you know, landed yourself? Have you any chance, do you think, of success, or is it still an uphill struggle?
of course there will be success. You know, we always say about the law of ecocide, it's not if, it's when. And, you know, I think you will agree that in the current climate, excuse the pun, of the environmental situation and the catastrophe we face after the IPCC report and World Wildlife Fund report, I mean, it's not funny. It's an extremely serious, catastrophic situation we're facing. So, I mean, the time is right, is it not? It is urgent, and the law of ecocide really can't wait too long. It has to happen in the very near future. Interestingly, Polly always did say 2020. She used to say, maybe I'm wrong, but she always, since I first met her, she said 2020.
So have you got any indication that in 2020 you will succeed?
Well, as I said before, you know, a lot of this, especially the kind of diplomatic endeavor, needs of its nature to be confidential, because when you're dealing with other nations and their governments, it is deeply necessary to be profoundly respectful of their process. And we cannot really say anything until we have their permission. All I can say is that the work is proceeding, and it is proceeding with great seriousness and with very, very committed intention on the part of everyone. And it looks extremely hopeful.
Okay, and what sort of support do you get in the industrial nations, the ones that have done all the polluting? Do you have people who sympathize with you or understand, politicians, for example, but volunteers as well? I mean, what general support do you have in the UK and elsewhere in countries like our own?
Well, yeah, I don't want to be too negative about this, and I don't want to say anything which sounds blaming, because I think basically we all want the same. We want a world that is healthy to live in and for us and our children and future generations. However, the present economic paradigm really has us in its clutches, whether we're addicted to fossil fuels or whether the power of money or so yeah, that is a hard one, and undoubtedly there will be a huge amount of pushback. That is why this business of the Earth Protectors, you know, when I talked about visibility, that is why it's so important that we have this huge surge of people behind this campaign, because then that pushback from the powers that be that are heavily entrenched in potentially ecocidal activity dedicated to profit, you know, they need to know that there is a real strength behind this movement.
But you must be encouraged, because, you know, you've got movements now that are developing, like Extinction Rebellion, the Invest campaign and so on. And it's got to the stage where public awareness is much greater. I gather, you know, people now, certainly in the UK, say climate change is the most important issue of all, above everything else. And that must encourage you that in a way, yeah, 2020, your time has come.
Mm. Yeah, of course, it's absolutely brilliant. I mean, it seems almost like it's being orchestrated. There is a huge convergence, you know, with all the amazing proliferation of XR groups all over the world, with Greta Thunberg and the youth movement and Youth for Climate. I mean, the last time Youth for Climate came out, there were 1,600,000 young people. And when they come out on the general strike on the 20th, there will be even more. So this is not getting less, it's getting more. And all of this is coming together to underpin Polly's work, really. And if you look at history, whenever you have had a major change to the history of humanity, it has always begun with people. You know, whether you look at civil rights or the suffragettes or the abolition of slavery, you have this huge uprising of people becoming more and more aware and more outraged that this cannot go on. And again, it's Polly's famous "enough, no more." This has to stop when you get to that level of an atrocity crime. And that level is now fast approaching. And then what happens? There's a change in the law. And that's where the law of ecocide comes in. So this is actually history in progress, and we are a part of that.
Okay, so if people wanted to get involved in your campaign, wanted to sign up and help you in any way, Where do they go and what do they do?
Right. First of all, they're not just helping us. We're all in this, and they are helping themselves and their children and everything on earth that lives. So we need to do this together. That's the first thing. So when they go to the website, there are many, many different indications of where they can join in and put their gifts and their effort and their commitment and their care for the earth into this huge movement. And it's very simple. It takes 2 minutes. There is a kind of donation level that is suggested. We always say it takes 2 minutes and a fiver. So €5 is a kind of minimum amount. And that is that idea of the ring-fence fund that goes to finance being able to put this law in place as an amendment to the Rome Statute with all that's involved. Then, of course, you can donate separately to support the team, to enable this work to continue. And as an earth protector, obviously, you can donate whatever you feel comfortable with.
Okay, right. Well, thanks very much. We've come to the end of our half hour now, and I think you've been through all that very comprehensively. And thank you for doing that. And thank you for the work that you're doing. And also to remember the fact that it was Polly who started it. Sadly, she's not with us, but her legacy lives on. So thank you, Anita, for joining us. And that's been really, really great.